Since I was going to start out talking about things that have happened that make Georgia move into where we are now, and that basically started with World War II and the end of World War II. Government up till then was pretty much the same through the years, and there were some very colorful people that were there doing government during those years. And it was a much smaller state and a much smaller budget than nowadays. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But the other thing he said on BRAC, he should have mentioned, because it's all his fault. Fort Gordon was also on the list when Governor Deal first went into office. And one of our thoughts was, we didn't think there would be a BRAC, but the administration was cutting budgets back in lots of different ways, so we were subject to it. So we tried to do the best we could to have ourselves BRAC-proofed and ready to be handy if that was going to happen. But Fort Gordon had, the Army had a unit there called the ASA, and it was a small unit, and it was kind of out of date. It was an information piece and intelligence, but not on the global scale that cyber has turned into being. And so we went to work on that. They had 1/3 of the command at Gordon and 2/3 of it at Fort Belvoir, right outside of Washington. And I can remember 30 years ago, Fort Belvoir was a sleepy little place, had a bunch of administrative stuff on it, a golf course, and a skeet range. Those are the three important things that I remember about that. But in the process of growing, they had two-thirds of what was going to become the Cyber Command. And they wanted to move from the unit out of Gordon up there. Well, living in the district area and around it in Northern Virginia is very expensive. And so we went at it from the standpoint of it would be a heck of a lot cheaper to move all of that to Augusta, where the cost of living was about 50% less in doing things. And that's where we started. We're lucky we had another friend of ours, named Will Ball, who was former Secretary of the Navy. And he had a lot of friends in the green eye shade business at the Pentagon. And too much gets done in those green eye shade places that you don't know about. And you don't ever know until it hits you. But we also had Saxby in the right spot on the Senate Armed Services Committee at that time. So when we opened up that can of worms, we fought it for about a year, I guess, before we got any traction at all on what we were doing. And after Saxby just about froze their promotion list for about a half a year up there, we got their attention, and they did agree with us that it was safer. Normal enlisted personnel that would be there working on those things couldn't afford to live within 50 miles of Belvoir. Just no way in the world they could do it if they were married or any jobs or anything else that was around it. But we got them down there. The whole command is almost there. The other thing, though, that is not as much talked about is that the south end of the fort is all ASA, it's the listening post for the Middle East for NSA. And it has about 7,000 people that work in there, and that's growing. So when we started doing stuff, the governor's office started helping get roads around it. The military started trying to do things. And at the time we went down there in the first tour, there was no direct line between the Army ASA and the NSA at the other end of the fort. You almost had, it was sort of like you saw something in a movie one time where they had to call the Pentagon and get transferred into there. But that's better now. But those are the little things that went on. I wanted to talk about the time that we started moving from a sort of a sleepy rural state into being what we are now. And for 6 straight years, going on 7, we're the most desired place for new business to be done in the United States, but almost in the world. There's been a very profitable trip to Germany in the last couple of months that we will see a lot more German industry here very soon. But this started, well, the history with Gene Talmadge is sort of a caricature into getting into modern Georgia. He was elected to the Agriculture Department in 1926. Things were big and going, and Georgia was still basically in the 1880s in our farming and our roads and the lack of paved roads and schools. But he was a lawyer. He was a summa cum laude graduate from the law school, spoke the King's English very well, and you would have never known it from anything that's left nowadays. Practiced law for a little while in Atlanta, and then moved down to Ailey and stayed down in Telfair County. Married a young widow who was Mattie Thurman, and she was Strom Thurman's cousin. Once upon a time, I had an intern stuck in the attic in top of the Russell building for a summer in the 190-something degree heat. And he found all these pictures that were up there and came back with a shot about that big of a young girl, looked like she was about 14 or 15, in a white dress, sitting on the corner of a step, holding this little baby. On the back it says, Mitt and Cousin Strom. And we had it redone, repitched up, put it in a decent frame, and took it over there. And as far as I know, it was buried with him. He had it in his office for years. But
y'all all know who Strom Thurman was.
Well, they would talk to each other a lot about being cousins when it was profitable. Sometimes they didn't mention being cousins when it wasn't. We had an agreement with the state of South Carolina that things on the Savannah River, if it was a federal project, one project would be named after somebody from South Carolina, and the next one would be after that. Well, when Senator Russell died, we were busy naming many, many things after Senator Russell. Well, Lake Russell and the Russell Dam up there. And we had, it wasn't our turn. So we had, I remember very well, we had a meeting in Senator Talmadge's office. And Senator Thurman raised his hand and says, "But Herman, it's not your turn." He said, "Strom, it's Dick Russell." Okay. And then later, when they were doing the lake down there at Augusta, I never can remember the name of it. We have a name on it from our side.
We call it Clark Hill.
Clark Hill.
Yeah. They call it
Lake Thurman.
Thurman. Same lake.
Same lake, just depending on which side you're.
State line crosses across it.
And there was a big disturbance in the Georgia General Assembly over this, of naming it Thurman. And I get this call one day, this was after I was way back in Atlanta, and it's Senator Thurman. "Right? You know Tom Murphy?" I said, "Yes, sir."
Y'all know who Tom Murphy was?
Tom Murphy was
serving Speaker of the House of Representatives in Georgia.
Longest of any served speaker. Yeah. Well, he's a great guy, and he was as honest as the day was long. If he told you something, that was it. You never had to go back and check it again. But he was pretty well set in his ways. And so were the people from that area of the state that were in the General Assembly. And they were very touchy about it. Well, we had agreed that there was the next time through would be South Carolina's turn to name something. But it had been Clark Hill forever. And somebody, I guess in South Carolina, wanted to change it to Blake Thurman to honor him. He, about that time, he must have been at least 100 years old. And he was in favor of that, of course. I went over to see Speaker Murphy, and he looked at me a minute and said, "I don't think Herman's going to be here to verify this." I said, "No, he sure isn't." "But you heard it." "Yes, I did." "I see what I can do." And that's where we left it, and it's still Clark Hill as far as I know.
And I might add a bit of historical note on it. Clark Hill has an E on the end of Clark. Now, it's named for a Revolutionary War hero whose name was, I think it was John Clark.
John Clark, yeah.
But his son, who later became the governor of the state of Georgia, he decided that with an E on the end of your name, Clark, you sounded too aristocratic. And so therefore he dropped the E off, and it was just Clark without an E.
And
that's little tidbit.
And that's Clark County in Athens now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, those things happen. Governor Talmadge, Gene Talmadge, went into office in 1932 when Dick Russell went to the Senate, and they got along pretty well at that stage. Governors in those days had 2-year terms, and they couldn't go more than 2 years successively. You could run again later, but it was a 2-year term. So after going through those 2 terms, there you are in 1936. And so Gene Talmadge ran against Dick Russell. Dick Russell was a big Roosevelt person and backed everything of the New Deal. And Gene Talmadge was probably 180 degrees in the other direction of it. And they fussed and fought all the way through it. Senator Russell won. So,
and he'd only been senator for 1 term at that point.
yeah, that was his first election,
term.
first trip into it. And it was a big thing because it involved the Roosevelt thing and the New Deal and this thing. So Gene Talmadge ran again in 1938 against Walter George, who was the other senator from Georgia and who had been there since 1922 and was very strong on foreign relations and finance committee at that time. And he ran Roosevelt didn't like him.
In fact, he came down to Georgia,
Right.
and endorsed
I can't
a guy
remember.
he's
Yeah.
faded from history,
Yeah.
against an incumbent
Senator.
U.S. senator from Georgia. And I think they were on the same platform together when FDR endorsed the sitting United States senator's opponent.
Yeah.
It was weird.
And he wasn't just a senator, he was chairman of the finance committee, which was rather important. That was why Roosevelt didn't like him. They were doing the court packing business in those days, and there was a lot of fury. Anyway, Gene Talmadge didn't win that year, and but he did run again in 1940 and was overwhelmingly reelected, and then got himself to governor. That would be his 3rd term, and one of the problems was that he also got in there, and there was a dean in Georgia, University of Georgia, named Cocking, and he was very enthusiastic about the Soviet formation, and there was a lot of this. This wasn't an unusual thing. It wasn't, run the flag up and communism, etc. But there was a lot of feeling because of the Depression and because of the work problems and what had happened in the country. Those were experiments that were going on in different parts of the world, and the Soviet experiments were looked upon in the press and in things here as a favorable model to look at. Well, evidently he was very enthusiastic about it, much more so, I guess, than Gene Talmadge thought he should be. So Gene Talmadge fired him, and this Board of Regents that the governor was talking about is a constitutional office, and it had been made so by Governor Dick Russell. And so it was a more not as stringently worded as it was now, and governors were also part of the board. I don't remember exactly in what cover that was. She had a chancellor and you had this and that, but I guess the governor was a member of the board. And so there was an attorney general named Ellis Arnold who was there then, and he took exception to firing teachers. And so it was a big fight. Ellis Arnold ran against Gene Talmadge in 1942 and won. Okay, the war started. You got all sorts of difference going on. Times were changing. These bases that the governor was talking about were growing then. Dobbins Air Force Base in Cobb County was a great big bunch of cornfields. And it became a Bell bomber plant. They built the B-29s there before Lockheed days. It was, and that was just one of the things. Warner Robins was named after a fellow named Warner Robins. And that's the story in that part of it. But it was a smaller base starting at the beginning of the war, and it grew. And it's now very close to being the largest base in Georgia, and probably still is in base structure, but the dollars spent will be bigger in Augusta by the end of 22 or 3 of what goes on there with cyber. So it won't be bigger because it just has more money. But all of those things were happening. We had all over South Georgia, there were small, there are a lot of, you'll see them if you fly over it, you'll see where there's some of those odd strips of concrete. Some of them grown up, some of them used for county airports and things like that. Those were all training things. We trained a lot of our pilots there in South Georgia. Flat, get up, fly around. Hard to get lost, and that was good. And we trained RAF down there. Brits had a big training operation. We had naval base, air at Albany, and a blimp base for patrolling the Atlantic at Gainesville, which is now Glencoe's base down there. But we still have a lot of bases. We haven't lost all of them. Been losing Fort McPherson when we did. That's where the Tyler Perry thing is. The governor was very kind and didn't ask. He just told me that I just volunteered to do something, and that he let me be on that commission for about 3 years. And we had to negotiate the sale, but not the selling it wasn't one thing. It was getting it away from the BRAC Army. And we had to buy it. And we didn't have money to buy it. Went down there and looked at it. There was some very nice places on there. And but anyway, long bunch of back and forth. And Tyler Perry came up with an offer which is fair for about 2/3 of the base. And the way the thing was done, you had to also have housing on it and other federal ties. We even looked at it from the standpoint of having the GBI and the crime labs moved down there at one time. And I still think that would have been a very good move, but we'd had to pay for it, so we sold it to somebody that already had a check. And but anyway, it worked out, and that was good. But 1946, Gene Talmadge decided he wanted to be governor one more time. And so and at that time, Herman Talmadge had been in the Navy since 1940. And it's probably hard for people that didn't know him to understand this, but he was not anywhere near as comfortable being in the center of things and flamboyance and all of his day. And he got the reason that he went into the Navy before the war started, went in intelligence, was to get away from being involved in the political structure. He pretty much helped run that 1940 campaign and then went. But when he got back after the war, he was executive officer on an attack transport in the South Pacific, and he was down there for the whole war. And he had come back, as did a lot of people from the war, with an entirely different view of the world than they had seen before they went off. So he found himself, and strangely, times where there wasn't any wool for clothes and things like that. So he had redone his naval uniform, took the brass buttons off of it and the stripes off the sleeves, and that was a blue suit. That was his lawyer suit. And he practiced law, or was planning to practice law in Atlanta. And he ended up running his daddy's election for that run in 1946, with the full intentions that he was not going to be involved from that point. He was going off practice law. And he had even thought about moving away, because it was hard to change anything if you had Talmadge written after the first name. And his dad died.
After he got into the Democrat primary, which for all intents and purposes was the only real election at that point.
Yeah. And he was elected, died in December before being sworn in. At the same time, there was a new constitution being done. First time the constitution had changed. And they created an office called lieutenant governor. We didn't have one before that. And so with him dying, it fell back on, did it fall to the old Constitution where the General Assembly would elect the person with the highest number of votes, write-in and otherwise, and they could appoint that. They, 20 years later on Bill Calloway and Lester Maddox, they reversed themselves and did it again. So, but at that time, General Assembly decided that there were enough, since he was not well up until then, and people thought he was going to die. Some bright soul in the Gene Talmadge world had decided to write in Herman, and so they had, and by something like 600 votes, it was that Carmichael was the other fellow that was running. So we ended up in the famous three-governor world. And Ellis Arnold said, "I'm not going to leave until there's a governor declared by the General Assembly." So he's in the office. That caused great turmoil because you had the General Assembly in session and at the hotel downtown, and Henry Grady. They're great stories. Henry Grady. The fellow that was a lieutenant governor was a fellow named M.E. Thompson, South Georgia. He had been the revenue commissioner for Ellis Arnold at one time. And Ellis Arnold, well, he was sort of a protege of his, and it worked out, and he was the lieutenant governor. Well, he's standing here. Governor Arnold's not relieving until the General Assembly does it, and they've appointed Herman Talmadge governor. So you have three guys standing there, not friendly, and a lot of things going on, a lot of raucous legislative members who are voting one side or another. And I have talked to Phil Landrum, who's a congressman from this part of the world. He was M.E. Thompson's chief of staff. He told me this story. I was with Senator Talmadge, and he told me this story. And I sat down with Ellis Arnold, and he told me. And strangely enough, when you get three politicians that all tell you exactly the same story, where they're standing here, here, or here, you kind of believe it must have been happening that way. So we've got that on tape from memory. Phil Landrum sitting in the room. But it was an interesting time. It made all the headlines. It was Life magazine, which is a big deal, and the 3 governor races was chalked up somewhere as one of the clown shows for the state of Georgia. But the Supreme Court had Senator Talmadge, Herman Talmadge, in as governor for 67 days. When they ruled that the new Constitution was in effect, he stepped aside immediately. They appointed M.E. Thompson acting governor until the next election, which was in 48, which Herman Talmadge by this time had changed his mind, I guess, about practicing law, because he was overwhelmingly elected in 1948, that 2-year term, and then a full 4-year term for 50 into 50.
That was part of the new Constitution.
New Constitution,
right. 2-year term to a 4-year term.
Right. But you couldn't succeed yourself then. So those years, Herman Talmadge brought back a lot of military organization to doing things. So we had no sales tax in Georgia then, and it was, and everybody ran for every office and saying we're not going to have any taxes. I don't know. Unfortunately, you can't do anything if you don't have anybody to do it with. So they had reluctantly decided that in 48, in that election that he won, it had been defeated. They were trying to pass a 1% sales tax, and had been defeated. But when he got elected again in 1950, first thing he did was say we're going to have a sales tax. It's going to be a 3% sales tax. So that caused great harm, great upset. His later conversation on that was that if I'd done one, we'd had to have done more later, and it's better to take all your medicine at one time. So he was extremely popular. It's kind of hard to picture the kind of things because it was radio and personal speaking. It was a different world. They had a speaking for governor's campaigns. Could be going on for 3 days, and instead of you buying the barbecue and putting it up, farmers brought their hogs and they'd slaughter them and cook them, and you had people there, and it was almost a comic thing. They had a group from this part of the state called the Haggards, the tree climbing Haggards. And one of them would get up in a tree down there, and when Genetown was talking, and he must have had a megaphone of some sort, you hear it so far, and then this guy in the tree would relay it to the people toward the back. And you had bands that played music at these things, and it was just a great show. I've got a picture somewhere, some 25,000 people at a barbecue and speaking down around Moultrie. And it's just amazing that people would do that. They'd come spend 3 or 4 days just to hear what somebody said.
Let me ask you one question. Do you know what the most famous piece of apparel that Eugene Talmadge had? You know, red suspenders.
Yalysis.
He would pop those suspenders apparently when he was making a speech. You know, that became his symbol.
Somebody would yell out in the crowd, "What about so and so?" I'm a coming to that. Pop those suspenders like that. But
by the way, if you're interested, I think I mentioned this once before because I just recently finished reading it. Just the biography of Eugene Talmadge, and it's called The Wild Man from Sugar Creek. It is an excellent, not a very thick little book, but some of the things that were going on in Georgia politics during that era that Rogers has just alluded to, you wouldn't believe. I mean, if you think some things are wild today, you ought to read some of the accounts of what were going on then. Excuse me.
I don't think you could make a movie on it.
You probably could.
The Wild Man from Sugar Creek was written by a fellow, Anderson, who, when it began, Miss Mitt, who lived to be 100, was still alive and well, and a lot of those people that were in there.
Now, Miss Mitt was Gene Talmadge's widow
Yes,
and
Herman
mother
Talmadge.
of Herman Talmadge.
She was the telegrapher down there that Gene Talmadge married, the widow, and Strom's cousin. But that the telegrapher thing threw me off because they had a luncheon in Atlanta sometime in the 70s, early to mid 70s. It's at the Marriott. You had this long table, it had about 14 or 16 of these old telegraphers. The railroad people put it on, the Norfolk Southern people put it together. And it was a thing to congratulate them and bring them together. And they had put these little telegrapher gadgets on the tables, and they were all hooked together. And if you were down in the audience, you could see this. And Miss Mitt, who was she rode horses until she was 95, and a very healthy lady. And Strom Thurmond lived to be 100 also. So there was something in the Thurmond line over there. But she was up there talking telegrapher to somebody else on there, and if you were down in the audience, you could see which one it was because little grins would come on their face and stuff like that. They could all hear each other, or all read each other. But Miss Mitt was talking to somebody down there, and you'd see these little grins, and then every once in a while you get a laugh, and all these other people, one time or two, they'd break out laughing. The whole crowd of them start laughing. Somebody's up there talking about how wonderful it was we were all that together. People laughing themselves to death. And it was Miss Mitt, and they all still remembered how to do the telegraph. And this was obviously several years later. So. But I think probably the thing that to get back on the changes, Herman Talmadge brought a lot of new things in. We also had other veterans back, and they brought things in. Marvin Griffin people make fun of that administration. He himself was a folksy South Georgia newspaper guy, but he went to the Citadel. He was a colonel in the Army, served in New Guinea. He was the lieutenant governor in that time. And that was almost running together. I mean, it wasn't a ticket, but it was a different kind of time. It wasn't a separate world that much.
Well, it was pretty much a solid Democrat primary.
All
at once. You had a general election, but
yeah,
there was never really any candidate in the Congress once it ran.
When I was growing up, you were either a Russell Democrat or a Talmadge Democrat, or an Anna Talmadge or an Anna Talmadge. That was the two parties that had broken into that. But it got tighter as the state, with that 3% tax, we were able to start building schools and roads, and interestingly enough, there must have been some surplus, which I can't imagine how much you could get just out of that tax base, but they did have, and Marvin Griffin got into that part after Talmadge left, and he had a brother who was a real character, and evidently cut a lot of side deals. I've had dinner on some tables in various judges' houses in South Georgia that came out of those mansions over on Jekyll. Don't know how that happened. But they're proud of the furniture, and it's really nice. And all came out of the Cheney Griffin world down there. But all that being said, Marvin Griffin was not a bad governor, and under him also we grew, and we grew more roads, we grew more teachers, we grew more schools. Herman Talmadge was big on trying to build hospitals and help things, and went after the Hill Burton funds like with Angie, and we have a lot of small hospitals around the state that are now no longer the way to do it, but we got more than we had, because in those days you didn't have a transportation system that would get you to the hospital within 3 days trying to do something. So it worked out. We had after Marvin Griffin, we had Ernie Vanderbilt next, I believe. And Ernie Vanderbilt was probably one of the most decent people that ever existed. Nice fellow, nice, good man. He had always been, he and his family were big Talmadge people. He married Betty Russell, who was Senator Russell's niece. And they blended well. That gave him an interesting political background. He had also been in World War II. He was a lawyer, and that blended the Talmadge people and the Russell people, and gave him a good base to get into politics on. And he was a good governor, I think. He inherited.
He was over in Livonia, not too far.
Yeah. He got it fell upon his time to be there for the thing that had been behind all of these governors was segregation. You had the laws changing in the country. Georgia had always been a basically states' rights oriented. That was the guys and the defense, and that was what made things go. And we moved into the late 50s and early 60s with that still hanging over us. Governor Vanderbilt, and I didn't know this until we taped him at the foundation, he and Carl Sanders and George T. George T.
Smith, who was the Speaker of the House.
And a lieutenant governor.
And lieutenant governor for the state.
He was late lieutenant governor was one of them, and Speaker of the House during the other. I put him in the middle to keep the other two honest. And they didn't really they got along with each other, but they were not close friends, Vanderbilt and Sanders. And they were each getting some things into these tapes. There's 5 hours of them in the Russell Library. And had Bill Shipp do them, which was fun. But he'd covered them both, and he did a lot of homework to do it, to good questions. But Governor Vanderbilt he was talking about the time when Jack Kennedy was nominated as a Democratic candidate for president, and he wasn't planning to go through Georgia. Presidential candidates didn't come through Georgia in those days. He was also Catholic, and there was a big row amongst people in the country of electing a Catholic president, and you didn't think about it until they did it, and when they did it, it really caused a bad fight amongst a lot of people. The integration process was going strong. President Eisenhower had sent the National Guard into Little Rock. Alabama was exploding in all different directions because of No Not One. Governor Vanderbilt told me once that the hardest thing that he thought that what he did wrong, and the worst decision he made was he was goaded into, during his first campaign, to say No Not One. He says, I regretted that from the time it got out of my mouth. So he ended up having to reverse his public stance on this, but it was a tough thing. And here we were in 1960 with a president and a nominee president. Well, that fall, Vanderbilt and most Southern governors had not come out for Kennedy on the ticket. And Governor Vanderbilt had called Senator Talmadge then and asked him if he could help put something together with the Kennedy people. He wanted to talk to them. Well, they got it done and had Bobby Kennedy and Sergeant Shriver, who was a brother-in-law, met in Senator Talmadge's Capitol office. Senators and congressmen have offices with seniority up in the side of the Capitol up there, and you get a lot of work done that way because you don't have to go all the way back and forth to the office building. And they set up the meeting in there. Governor Vanderbilt came up. He said, "I will endorse Jack Kennedy if you'll promise not to send troops into Georgia. He says, we'll handle it, and you let us handle it our way, and we'll do it." And so they shook hands, and that was the deal. We never had federal troops in Georgia. But lo and behold, we had 2 people integrate the University of Georgia about 3 months later. So it all came home to roost at the same time. And there was talk every day that the schools were going to close. I was in school there then, and I can promise you that we rallied every night. We didn't care whether or not school was integrated. We did care about not having to go to class the next day. And we did our dead level best to enjoy whatever party we could to get it up to that state. And then next morning, damn it, they hadn't done anything about closing the school, and we're back in again. Several years later, Governor Vanderbilt had a house up on in Sky Valley, and he and they without getting into all the details of it, he would sit up there and talk, and we'd watch football sometimes, and a lot of these things came out. That story never had come out until we were doing it there, and we taped it. And somewhere in the process of when they were changing tapes and getting redone for the next session of it, we didn't have cell phones either. I went charging down the hall, found a telephone, called Senator Talmadge, who was in Lovejoy at that time, out of office. And I said, Senator Vanderbilt just told me this story, and we're putting it in there. He says, "Ernie told you that?" Did. "Well, it's true, but it's his business." I said, "You never mentioned it." I said, "It's his business." But a lot of things like that, Talmadge would never tell you anything if he went down and had a meeting with the president, any president. He'd never talk about it other than whatever the public part of it was. Come back and say, "Well, what'd the president say?" "Well, we had buttermilk." But times are so different now. With what goes on in Washington and the divides, it's so hard for people to talk across aisles. It's hard to have friends in other parties. I think a lot of it's because nobody lives up there anymore. They don't know each other. It's kind of hard to be really nasty about somebody when you've got their kid in the back seat on Saturday morning coming from a softball game and taking them to McDonald's to get everybody a hamburger, and you can't call them dashy names and things when you got the kid there. So it causes a certain degree of friendliness that's not apparent anymore. Well, moving on down in there, we had Lester Maddox, we had Carl Sanders first. And Carl Sanders was in the state senate. He'd been in the House and the Senate. He was another refugee from World War II. And a lot of this thing going back to World War II is that you had a whole generation of people that had served in one capacity or another, some of them in bigger roles than others according to the age as they moved along and had time. And that changed a lot of the view that they had. And this was happened also in the General Assembly and in everybody's business out there. So everybody had sort of a common thing they had in common, and some things that, they served with each other, but they all had a similar experience. And it was a different experience than what we had prior to that in a society that had dirt roads and muddy dirt roads And an awful lot of people, when they were drafted into World War II, had never driven an automobile, never seen one that worked. They didn't have one. They had mules. They didn't. Radios were mostly crystal sets that they'd built, and or you could run a line up the top of the pole outside and pick up WSB, which was a clear channel 50,000 watt station, or you could pick up the W.B. Wilson station on the air everywhere from the heart of the Ohio Valley, and they played good music at night. You had you had radio, but it didn't translate into local stuff until after the war. Accents changed. I can remember when you could tell the difference whether somebody lived in West Georgia or Southwest Georgia or Northeast Georgia or different parts. You had accents that worked. Sandersville had its own world in there, and it had a sound that was different than television ruins accents.
Midwestern.
Everybody
sounds
sounds.
on major television.
But every one of these governors, and all of, and Sanders was a very progressive governor. He was one of the new governors. Really, he was a break from all of these other people were pre-war people up to that point. And Sanders was a post-war, and when he announced he was going to run for lieutenant governor, and went around the state and discovered that he had to make just as many speeches to do that as he did to run for governor, and he switched. He announced it in Augusta in the morning and took a helicopter, unheard of, over to the Capitol and made his announcement there and signed up for governor. He was sort of the Camelot era guy that you looked at with it, and he used that a lot in his campaigns. Cufflinks Carl.
He was a handsome guy.
Yeah.
And his widow is still living, and she's very good friends with my wife. She's 93, I think now.
Quite an artist too.
Oh, he's quite an artist. Yeah.
Well, Governor Sanders only died like 6-7 years
ago. Time I was governor.
Yeah.
You might add the role that Ellis Arnold played in throwing the election into the Georgia House of Representatives that elected Lester Maddox.
Yeah.
And what happened to Bo Calloway in the process.
Right. The election of '66, I think it was. You had a young state senator from Plains and down around Americas that was running. And Ellis Arnold and somebody else. I can't remember the Democratic primary.
Ellis Arnold had been the governor.
He had been governor and was going to run again. Yeah. And he lost in the primary, and then ran as a write-in candidate, and that's what caused the mix between and Lester Maddox won the Democratic primary, and Bo Calloway, who was congressman from that area, and a West Point graduate, a very sort of suave-looking guy too, and he came from a very well-known family in that part of the world, Callaway Gardens, and what they put together. He was a very strong candidate. The first time there had been a Republican on a race at that level, and he did a good job of it. He and Lester Maddox ran against each other. I think Bo had the most votes, didn't he?
The most
popular votes, but you had it through because Ellis Arnold had gotten write-in votes, and that split the thing. You had 3 people up again. And that's where the court reversed itself on what they'd done in '46.
And threw it into the House of Georgia House of Representatives.
Yeah.
And Maddox was the Democrat candidate. Callaway was the Republican, and I don't think there were any
3 Republicans in the whole House or something like
Republicans
that.
in the whole House at that point, so you can pretty well predict what happened, and that's how Lester Maddox got to be governor.
And you know, he really wasn't a bad governor. Now, everybody expected him to be a bad governor, but he appointed good people and had some very good people in there. And he probably appointed more minorities and black and women and things than anybody had up to that point. He wasn't a bad governor.
Why did Bo Calloway go to Colorado after he lost the race?
That didn't happen that quickly. He was Secretary of the Army in the Nixon and Ford times. And he was in Washington. Then he had done other things. He built the business down there, Callaway Garden, and got involved with Callaway out there. They started a golf and resort ski thing. I've forgotten where the town was. But he had intervened in that time. He had been Secretary of the Army. And after that, I guess it was when Carter was elected, he left Washington and went to Colorado, working on that resort that they built out there, and was out there for 20 years before he came back. And he was back, he died 7, 8 years ago, something like that. Never got
in Columbus. He was in Columbus at that time.
He never got back in politics or anything directly. I think he was around a lot of places.
Did he run for the Senate in Colorado?
You what?
Bo Calloway run for the Senate.
Did he ever really qualify?
It was between Gary Hart, him, and another Republican lady, but
Yeah.
I think he got like third out of the whole
Yeah, I don't.
general.
Yeah, he never quite made it into
He
that.
was a very, very charismatic guy.
Yeah, he was.
Really, very much so.
He was. He had the thing that I can remember. A young lady coming up to me and saying, "He has the best eyebrows." He had these big, bushy, gray eyebrows. But
That's the reason I wore paisley tie. I know the ladies like paisley tie. I told Avery that she complimented me on my tie. I said, I would work for these ladies.
well, he was an interesting guy, and he was a big supporter on the Army. He and Will Ball, when Will was Secretary of the Navy, Bo was on. We had trains that went to Philadelphia to the Army-Navy game, and the Navy car was here and the Army car was here, and of course everybody knew each other, so there was all this back and forth in there, but great rivalry on it. And Bo was on the BRAC Commission in 1990, which was the first BRAC, and so was Will Ball. And Moody Air Force Base was on a closure for BRAC at that time. And
That's not about hostile with you all.
Yeah.
Or our state or not.
it's an older base, and it came out of World War II also. But the Air Force had been trying to close it since the 50s. And every time something would come up, it got saved. This time around, you had BRAC up. We had Will Ball and Bo Ginn and Bo Calloway on the commission, and I thought, we're not going to have to worry about this. That'll be good. Bo immediately recused himself, and that left Will there. To give you some background on Will, you've heard I said something about him about what happened at Fort Gordon. Will is also very helpful and has been extremely helpful in Georgia on doing these things. And Will was in the Navy when I was up there, and Senator Talmadge on the Watergate Commission. Well, high tech in those days was we got new typewriters, Selectrics. That was high tech. That was our concession. We were the only people the people that were on that Watergate Commission got new typewriters. We had Selectrics. But Senator Talmadge was adamant that we would not do any Watergate business during business hours. So, and we didn't. And so, but we had a jillion letters that were in there all the time and they had to be answered. That was the other rule. Nothing stayed 3 days in the office. That was hard to do sometimes. But we had volunteers set up, and Will was in the Navy around the corner down there in the Navy offices, down the hall and around the corner from our office in the Russell Building. And so he had gone to Georgia Tech on a scholarship from the Navy scholarship through Strom Thurmond in South Carolina. He was from up there. And so he felt like he was a kinship, and we certainly liked anybody that could type. So we had Coca-Colas were already free, peanuts were already free, and we ordered up pizzas. And that everybody would get in there about 7 o'clock, and it was good. The letters got answered, and all that. Well, came time for him to go back. He'd done 2 sea duty tours by that time, and he was about to go back again. I wasn't sure he wanted to do that. And we persuaded him to take a pay cut from being a lieutenant in the Navy to being a peon in the office. So he was an assistant in the legislative office. And he, with the understanding that we would try to help him do otherwise. Well, Senator Chalmers went to Senator Eastland, asked about it. Those days, the committees were not Republican and Democrat committees. You just had committees, and you were assigned to different people. And so, Senator Stennis was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee at the time. So we went to him, and Senator Stennis and Chalmers were very good friends. And he said, well, I think I've got one next year that'll come up. It's going to be at John Tower. And he said, do you think your boy can work for a Republican? Chalmers looked at him and says, well, he does now. So I don't know whether he meant him or me. I don't know which one. But anyway, he went on to do that. He came back. He took my place when I left Senator Chalmers' office as his chief of staff, and then he went to the State Department, was the assistant secretary of state. Well, first he went back to the committee, Senate Armed Services Committee, where he worked with Tower, and then over to the State Department, where he did the assistant secretary for the Hill. And that got him into the Reagan administration because they liked him a lot, and he went over into that, and he headed up all congressional work for House and Senate for President Reagan. And in the last couple of years of President Reagan's thing, he had a fellow that was a secretary of the Navy who was prone to make speeches that didn't go with the president sometimes. His name was Webb. I remember him very well, later in the Senate from Virginia. But he did something one day, and they had a meeting every morning at 8 o'clock with the president. And staff did not intervene in those things too much unless spoken to. You didn't normally jump up and scream. And somebody read what Webb had said at a speech the night before to the president. And he says, well, don't know what we should do about that. And Will, in a fit of unusual not control, says, fire the son of a bitch. He said it out loud. And there was more silence in the room. And Will knew right away that wasn't, he was thinking it. That wasn't what you're supposed to say. And so it was it passed on. Well, later in that day, Will had been composing himself to write his resignation letter, try to explain to Patty why they couldn't pay the grocery bill, do those kind of things and all that. And Carlucci and what was the chief of staff's name? Tennessee, Republican leader in the Senate. I just got a blank. Anyway, 2 of them came in, sat down on the couch across from Will and said, well, the president spoke to us about your comments this morning. And Will said he was trying to sink down under the thing and couldn't know exactly how he was going to handle this thing and be manful about taking his being fired. And so, and they couldn't hold themselves, and they were both broke out laughing and pointing. He'd like to know if you'd like to take his place as Secretary of the Navy. And then Will said, I didn't know whether I should jump over the table and hug him and kiss him and do all that good stuff and probably get fired for that. Or just sit there and say, well, I didn't talk to Patty about that. Anyway, that's how he got to be Secretary of the Navy at that particular time, and he did a very good job of that on into the Bush administration. But
We want to stop
we're
there and
run
see
out.
if they've got any questions that
Yeah.
might like to ask. We've got about 8 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Back over here.
I have a question. So Governor Bill talks about how Hope had to be reworked so that we could still have money to go to school on.
Yep.
And my question is, when Hope first started in 1993, the average cost of tuition in the University of Georgia system was like $10,000. That was room and board and everything.
Yeah.
Now it's almost $25,000. So my question is, why hasn't the board region done a better job of keeping costs down?
Because we have more students than we did, we have more buildings than we did. We have the Hope Scholarship, which limits the size of it, but it has increased the population of the 26 schools of the system. Technically, the Board of Regents owns all 26 colleges and things, and that's their fiefdom. As the governor said, regents hire the chancellor, governors appoint the regents, regents hire the chancellors, interview the presidents of the colleges, and hire the presidents of the colleges. The running of the schools, this school, all schools, is done from that point down. But you've got a system in the University of Georgia system, is what this is known as. And during the years that for Governor Deal, there were 36 schools in there. We're down to 26 in mergers. There were mergers because it saved back office money all the way through. That probably saved somewhere between $500 and $600 million over some of those years. We changed when I was in school, you'd have a professor that would change 3 words in a chapter someplace, and then you had to buy a new book. And they were big books and they were expensive. You had to haul them around everywhere. Now we've gone to open print type things. You can get most everything on your computer. Y'all can tell me where that fails, but the overall picture of it was that we could do this cheaper. It would save money to doing it. All in all, with the concessions, with the changes of the insurance things, the changes with teaching, we, Board of Regents has not asked for a raise in tuition for 4 out of the last 8 years. I think that's right. There has been monumental increases on things, and everything is higher, as you say. But those are the things that have cut back on the money of what it costs the state. When I was in school, the state paid probably 75 to 80% of your tuition. And you paid it, I think, we were on quarter system when I was in school, and it was something simple like $70 a quarter. So you can see, of course, $70 in those years would be closer to $400 or $500 now. So there's not competitiveness. We've got 2 research schools in the system that are in the top 20 in the United States. We didn't used to have that. We didn't have the quality of research that we've got now. We didn't have the infrastructure of doing these things. All those things costing more and inflated numbers and everything else. I think all in all, I don't know that we're the absolute best in the country on doing it, but we rank in the top 4 or 5 in the country the system working. All states don't have a system. And in some places, South Carolina, those presidents, each ones have to go for their budget to the General Assembly every year. We don't have pleasant dealings with the General Assembly at all times on those things, but we are in what's known as the governor's budget. And we make our regents make their argument to the OPB and to the governor's people. We work out how you can do it, what can be done, and what that price is. Then we don't change it. We go in that budget. We can fight like hell before then, but once it's done, it's the governor's budget, and we start with that. Now that's a nutshell of it, but basically there's a lot of work that goes on with about 150 people on that staff all the time trying to make it cheaper and keeping the quality up. And we got pretty good quality.
2 minutes.
Quick question, kind of to go on, like continue that. So, in regards to the stimulating factors of that, would you say it's going to be hard to kind of contain the cost of tuition in the future, given, as we were talking about, like Georgia's booming because the business people are moving in, homes are being developed. That means
New classes,
new
new subjects.
class expansion as well. So, in other words, costs will continue to go up. So the big question is, how do we find stimulating ways to counter that to where tuition is not going to
Go out of sight.
Yeah.
Part of the biggest argument you usually get out of the General Assembly people, and they are usually the ones that start this. But that's the interesting thing is they don't understand that we have to pay for those instructors and we have to pay for the insurance, and it's a business. It's about a $2-point-something billion business. And it's run a lot like one, except for the fact that it's not. It's a public thing. You're doing your dead level best to keep prices down. It's not like there's not a big class. There's no Regent's airplane. There's none of that. And you don't pay Regents. So you've got a volunteer board appointed by governors, and I can say in Governor Deal had ran the best, and I'm not saying this because he's sitting here, but he ran the best governor's office that's been done in my lifetime.
Let me chime in on one of those things too.
Okay.
One of the things that many people say would reduce the cost of higher education would be to eliminate tenure among professors. Because with tenure, it makes it very difficult for a college president to get somebody that, for whatever reason, may not be appropriate for a teacher anymore. The only institution I'm aware of in the system is Gwinnett.
Mm-hmm.
Gwinnett College, I don't know whether it's now a university or
It
not.
is.
It is a university. It's one of the, population-wise,
Right.
students, it's one of the biggest. But it has no tenure for their professors. And yet, one of the arguments for tenure is, well, if you don't offer a professor tenure, you will not get your choice of the best ones. Gwinnett is proving that not to be true. They have a very large number of professors who are asking to be employed there, even though they know they don't have tenure. So that's a very timely question.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a lot of discussion about it as we try to hold down the cost of higher education. It's tough to do because it's like anything else. Costs go up. And in addition to the consolidation of schools, and of course, University of North Georgia is an example of that. Gainesville College rolled into it as a part of it. But there are also some other things that are probably going to go on in the future. You're going to probably see, and you're already seeing it to an extent, you're going to see a change in attitude by would-be students, as we have recognized that blue-collar jobs many times pay higher incomes than traditional college degree jobs. And that's been especially true in a state like ours where the manufacturing and job growth has been so significant. And one thing that a lot of people don't know is our technical college system that supplies the training for those that need those technical skills is not under the Board of Regents. Board of Regents is constitutionally separate, as Rogers told you. The technical college board and the technical college system, they're directly under the control of the General Assembly and the governor's office, unlike the college and university system. So there's a distinct difference there. They get along, and one of the real things that have to be congratulated for is that they have, what do you call those agreements where you can take something that one and
Right. Yeah.
what?
They're, at some types,
Can't think of the name of it, but is what?
Reciprocity?
Well, that's what you would normally think, but they got a different word for it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, in higher education, you gotta have another word. But anyway, there are certain courses that you can take in the technical college system that will transfer credit for it into the university system under the Board of Regents, and vice versa. We don't have time to talk about it today, but think about it, because one of the big issues in this General Assembly session is dual enrollment. How many of you were dually enrolled students at some point? Okay. There are presently over 50,000 high school students who are dually enrolled in our state. And the General Assembly and the governor is having to cope with that, because a dually enrolled student, the high school that they come from still gets full reimbursement for them as a student, even though they may only be there on one or two classes during the day. Some of them, not at all. But the high school still gets full payment for them as if they were a full-time present student. And the state picks up the cost within the technical college or the university system for their college-type classes. The state pays that. So you say, well, the state's paying dual. Why are you doing that? Well, when we didn't do that, the teachers in the high schools did not encourage any student to dually enroll.
Right.
Because they would lose the money that that student represented if they left and went to a college or a technical college. So, talking about places to save money, there are a lot of places that come up. But let's give Rogers a hand.
Thank you.